Well, we go around the panel and get some sort of general views of Churchill the man. Should we start with you, Stelios?
No.
Okay. We start with you, Josh.
Sure. So I had this conversation with Calvin. I basically said that, I don't know too much about Churchill the man, so I'm going to be quiet for a lot of this. But I do have a personal grievance against him that my grandfather was on the HMS Repulse, which got sank by the Japanese off the coast of Singapore. And they were there with the Prince of Wales, basically undefended by air support.
The actual Prince of Wales?
The ship, the Prince
Right.
of Wales. Yes, the Prince himself was not seaborne. And those ships were sunk at great loss of human life. And I think that his oversight there to send them to defend the East as two ships against the Japanese Air Force and Navy was a bit silly. It seemed ridiculous. He massively underestimated the military capabilities
There were more
of
than
the Japanese.
a few sort of military blunders.
Yes,
History.
but this had real consequences for my grandfather. He, inhaled a lot of the engine oil when the ship sank and suffered health complications from that until he died. And of course, he also saw many of his friends on board die. And this was something that could have been avoided had, that it's not as if the information available to Churchill, that we can see now, it's not the benefit of hindsight. Even at the time, this was seen as a blunder because, you've got the sinking of the HMS Hood that showed that these large ships could be sunk and that you need to be careful. You need to have adequate support. You need to approach these things with a greater appreciation for human life than I think he had.
Well, and that's something that crops up again and again. Like he sunk a French fleet at one point. There's the whole Gallipoli campaign. I mean, there were a number of. I mean, that was one example, but there was a number of sort of blunders like that. Mm-hmm. Moving around the panel, Connor, you want to try and still have a career in something approaching mainstream media. How would you like to blow that up at this point?
Well, I actually think that Beau's trilemma of opinions on Churchill is perfectly summarised, actually. I think friends of the show like Douglas Murray and Ray Fatal-Mancu can make a really strong case for the heroic merits of Churchill. But speaking as someone who's raised in the, let's say, schizophrenic school system of England, I've come to the conclusion, and done reading since, of course, I've come to the conclusion that he's in this category of great men in the sort of Carlylean sense of where you could put Hitler in this box, we could also put Alexander the Great in this box and Napoleon in this box. They're exceptional men of exceptional times who changed the course of history forever. I know I'm going to be accused of fence sitting for that, but he obviously had his positives and his negatives. I say that about the school system because we were taught primarily about the three great sins of Western civilization being the transatlantic slave trade, the First World War and the Second World War. And so we're taught the First World War, that Churchill was behind the Gallipoli campaign, led to the needless massacre of thousands of troops. And then also he is the unmitigated hero of the Second World War, and every single measure and international institution he set up since is an unalloyed good. And I think, look, I'm glad that Britain's involvement in the Second World War ended up ending the Holocaust. It's why I don't think we need a Holocaust memorial right next to Parliament, because we have the Churchill statue, and that's one of the few statues I wouldn't get rid of around Parliament, because Cromwell and Nelson Mandela are there. I think they're ripe for it. But also, if you read something like James Barr's Lord of the Sand, Lords of the Desert, rather, the way that the British Empire was hacked up and sold off piecemeal to establish the American Empire, which has made numerous foreign policy blunders since, you can say that Churchill's legacy, no matter the moral benefits of our involvement in the Second World War, Churchill's legacy can be criticised fair-mindedly by any sort of mainstream historian. And I think the only reason this has been inflamed, this sort of conversation, is something we haven't mentioned yet, is because of that recent Tucker Carlson interview with Daryl, what's his last name?
Daryl Cooper Martin-Maid.
That's it, Daryl Cooper Martin-Maid. I watched it and I thought that, so I haven't listened to the rest of Daryl's content, but it did seem very much like, to me, and again, I haven't read Pat Buchanan's book on this, and I know Harry has, so he'll be able to tell more. It seemed a lot like, to me, very well-read Americans talking about European history from a satellite length view, and that maybe some of the historical considerations of, for example, Churchill being born in the Victorian period weren't necessarily in play in that conversation. So he's a great man with flaws, full stop.
Mm. Harry, you've done a lot on the pre-war period, and I know you have views on this subject. Take us through that.
Right, well, I'm not going to claim in the first place that I'm anywhere near as well read as others are, particularly Bo. I've done a fair enough amount of reading to have a perspective on the matter, and I would say that my own perspective falls much more closely to Bo's than maybe some others. But I'm not going to be claiming that I'm any form of expert on the subject matter. I'd like to address the why we're having this conversation subject right now, seeing as Connor brought it up, which is the interview with Daryl Cooper on Tucker Carlson's show, Marta Maid, who runs a historical podcast, and he's looking into World War II at the moment, which garnered a mass of criticism from all sorts of people in the neoconservative and centre-right spheres, which I thought was completely unwarranted. It was emotional and hysterical screeching from people who made it very, very clear that they had not watched the interview, of which the discussion of Churchill was only a very, very small part. Cooper at one point says that he was speaking to a friend who he said, in a way to try and provoke him using hyperbole, that he thought that Churchill was the arch villain of World War II. From my own reading, I would not agree with that assessment. I would say that there is a lot to criticize Churchill for, and that includes things like escalating the conflict by involving Norway in it, escalating the conflict by trying to prolong it following the evacuation of Dunkirk, by allowing unrestricted saturation bombing of civilian targets, which led to Hitler coming over to the Blitz. But the unfortunate fact of the matter is that if you bring up any of these things, which are historical and documented facts, a lot of people with vested interests in maintaining the current regime and world order that we live in begin to throw out name calling, ad hominems, emotional arguments without addressing anything that you're saying, and accuse you in doing so of trying to mitigate the evil of Hitler, trying to downplay the character of Hitler, which I don't think is what Daryl Cooper or anybody else is attempting to do. In the slightest, you can acknowledge that a man is flawed without turning around and saying that all of the atrocities that Hitler signed off on in the Eastern Front, like the Einsatzgruppen, the camps that were set up there, even divisions like the Derlewanger, you can read about those things and be sickened by what went on the Eastern Front, whilst also acknowledging that Churchill had flaws and made mistakes. And I talk about the vested interests of our current world order, which is that it has been massively mythologized, which is one of the main things that Cooper and Carlson were speaking about. And I'd like to explain what the mythology is right now and to explain its function. Essentially, the positioning of World War II as the good war, with a very, very, very cartoonish, I described it as the Marvel cartoon, as Bo suggested, black and white 2D characterization of the Second World War, has a lot of political function right now as it pertains to Western and particularly American foreign policy. Because what ends up happening, you see it every time you see it with the Ukraine-Russia war, every single war that takes place, the bad guy, so to speak, is positioned as the new Hitler. If anybody is in favor of peace or just not going to war, not sacrificing lives unnecessarily, you're positioned as the new Chamberlain. And anybody who is in favor of war, say Boris Johnson and his sabotaging of the peace talks with Ukraine and Russia, they are the plucky Churchill character. And this has been the consistent rhetoric used to drag the West and the US into war after war after war ever since the Second World War. And I would say that obviously a lot of people make a lot of money from such things, and the US gets to expand its power across the world, or certainly attempt to do so. And the reason that we're speaking about this right now is because I think there is a lot of utility in dispelling those myths, or at least attempting to. And more than anything else, I believe it's the same for everybody on this panel. My upholding principle beyond anything else is the truth. And I believe that there is a lot of truth that is left off the table when discussing Churchill. And if we try to speak of the truth, and all of a sudden we get accused of being Nazi apologists, Hitler apologia, all of those things, then what is the point of it all? You can go through the truth without diminishing the crimes that Hitler did commit. He signed off on a lot of terrible and awful things throughout the Second World War, and just pointing out that Churchill made mistakes as well does not diminish any of that. So sorry to drop a little essay there.
Harry, that was great. That was really, really good.
Go on then, Bo.
I absolutely agree that I find that it's just an infuriating and obviously nonsense, non sequitur to say that any criticism of Churchill means you must be pro-Nazi. What nonsense! It's like, I criticise Keir Starmer, therefore I must be pro-Kemi Badenoch. No, what? That doesn't follow. Come on, get real. Let's talk about real history. Let's talk about real things, can we? But that's what it's funny though. It's interesting, isn't it? When you get a leftist, some leftist revisionist, going on morning TV, being very, very critical and rude of Churchill. They never get that thrown in their face, do they?
No.
Someone moaning about how he caused a weather system to cause flooding and famine in India or Bangladesh. They don't immediately get criticised for being, you're pro Hirohito then, are you? Oh, you're pro Japanese imperialism then, are you? Like, no, it doesn't happen because it's a non sequitur. It doesn't. Anyway, so Harry's right on that, absolutely 100%. And I'll take no criticism on that. If I criticise Churchill and say, "Oh, you're pro Hitler then, are you?" No, and I won't hear of it. I won't take that seriously.
Well, it works the other way around as well, of course, doesn't it? Because I mean, at the weekend, Stilios, you put out a fairly simple tweet, which is to say it's uncomplicated to say that Hitler was an evil man, which is fine, fair enough. But people then started jumping down your throat on that because they assumed that therefore meant that you were saying that Churchill was a hero.
Yes, I mean it's a tweet specifically designed to frustrate Hitler apologists, and the only reason people would go after this is because they found the statement that Hitler is somehow an evil person and is to be considered an evil person objectionable. As far as I'm concerned, there's zero doubt about that. Now, when it comes to this, when it comes to Churchill, and obviously, I'm Greek, you're English. To an extent, it's not my position to say much about it. It's your position. It's your position. You have the first word on this. It's more of an internal and domestic affair.
I'm going to give you an Anglo pass if you need it.
Yeah, feel free. I talk about Achilles or whatever all the time without worrying about it.
It's okay. No, I know this, and obviously you're much more well versed into the history of Churchill about this. Some personal issues. We could all speak about our families and talk about World War II, and that's understandable. And obviously, I think criticizing Churchill is absolutely constructive. Every person who holds power should be criticized, and criticized for perpetuity. But there are several kinds of criticism, and here is where I think I'll depart with some of what has been heard so far, is that there are criticism of Churchill that are trying to say Churchill was not a hero or not a saint. Yeah, obviously. Or criticism that say that Churchill took some disastrous decisions or decisions that had disastrous consequences. No doubt. Yeah. I think that Bo is absolutely right. Just criticizing Churchill doesn't essentially make you straightforwardly a Hitler apologist or something. Then there are other people, though, who are criticizing Churchill in order to bring down Churchill the myth that a lot of people are referring to as post-war consensus. Others are referring to as boomer truth, or in all sorts of ways. I think that this is a very interesting conversation that is incredibly confused. The kinds of links that people draw from that to talk about the world of today and Churchill in World War II seem to me to involve massive leaps of inference.
Perhaps if you're attacking Churchill the man, but if you're attacking Churchill the myth, then perhaps it does serve that purpose.
Well, we have time, I think. We can move step by step. And then there are criticisms of Churchill and Churchill the myth that are trying to be, pro-Nazi apologia and pro-Hitler apologia. There are people like that. So I think, number one, criticizing Churchill is absolutely good and constructive. It's how the past and history liberates us. It shows us the past, and it shows us that what we live right now isn't the only thing we can live. But just try to go down and do this as, you know, pro-Nazi apologia is just wrong as far as I'm concerned. And the thing is that when it comes to what Harry said before about the Cooper interview and the Tucker interview, I think that I watched it as well, and it was a very interesting interview, but also an interview that I'm way more skeptical about than you are. And okay, that's, you know, that's how we view things. But it seems to me that people right now attack Churchill the myth because they link it with what they claim to be, let's say, the post-war consensus, which is very vaguely defined. And a lot of the time, people are just throwing in anything they personally dislike into the post-war consensus. And so frequently they lose what is of substance, because I will address this point that Harry made, because I've seen a lot of the time about the justification for war. I think if World War II didn't happen, wars would still go on. And the side that would engage in aggression, the side that would be imperialistic and expansionist, would use rhetoric, would employ rhetoric. And the rhetoric that they would employ would directly appeal to the symbolic notions of the time, of the public. So if in public consciousness it weren't the case that Churchill is the good Anglosphere man and Hitler is the bad guy, it could be Napoleon is the bad guy and the Iron Duke is the good man, and, you know, the next kind of aggression would be justified in terms of the legacy of Iron Duke. So what I want to say with this is that when we're talking about rhetoric and the kinds of symbolic status and notions that rhetoric appeals to, this is completely secondary. Wars and foreign aggression comes with empire, and a propaganda will be used that will constantly appeal to the symbols. Churchill is a symbol after World War II, and it shouldn't be seen as a saint. Again, I say this.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.